Welcome back, students. This week we're going to be going over chapter 7, which gets into some business expenses for AGI. Some of these get to be a little complicated. Um, there's certain calculations involved with some of them. Uh, we'll go over and I will explain what I mean. Okay, so here we got chapter 7, businesses, expenses, and deferred compensation. Skip pages 25 and 27. Learning objectives. Understand the deductibility of business and rental real estate activities, distinguish the classifications of employees and independent contractors, determine the proper deductible amount for travel expenses, understand the deductibility of transportation expenses at business meals, identify deductible moving expenses, describe the requirements for deducting education expenses, determine whether the expenses of an office and home meet the requirements for deductibility, and apply the gross income limitations, discuss the tax treatment for various deferred compensation arrangements, describe tax filing considerations for business expenses and deferred compensation, describe compliance and procedural considerations for business and deferred compensation expenses. Let's get into it. So here we've got various types of employee expenses. Here we've got reimbursed expenses incurred by the employee. Think auto mileage. Think, you're a W-2 employee and you pay $10 for supplies for something related to your job. Your employer reimburses you the $10. Um, the employee can deduct these for AGI if the amounts were taken into income. The IRS also has a wash rule with that, where if I pay $10 and then I receive $10, it all nets out the same. That they're okay with you not reporting that, right? I use my own personal after-tax dollars. I receive this money. I'm going to treat it as after-tax dollars. Unreimbursed expenses, expenses incurred by the employee, not reimbursed by the employer, and not deductible starting in 2018. That's the TCJA. I can't claim a deduction for, if that $10 that I paid for supplies and your employer never reimbursed me, I don't get to deduct that. Prior to 2018, you could with certain limitations, but in 2018, it's just you get no deduction. Employer-employee relationship. Employer has the right to control and direct individual who provides services with regard to end result and means by which result is accomplished, timing of the work, location of the work, how it's completed, properly classifying employees, contractors versus employees. And it is cheaper for the business to call you a contractor because they don't have to pay payroll taxes on you. That's where the self-employment taxes come in. This is a more nuanced issue than a lot of people realize. The IRS has, I think it used to be 17-point tax, now I think it's 20, to try to define whether someone is an employee or an independent contractor. I'll give you a personal example. My dad, when he retired, he went back to his place of work and he would do janitorial. He just, kind of clean, just something to kind of keep him busy. He used his own vehicle to drive there. They provided the cleaning supplies, um, but he set his own schedule, right? He said, okay, you know what, I'm going to work Tuesdays and Thursdays, but if he showed up on a Wednesday, no one's there, no one's supervising him. So where does he fall under an employee or an independent contractor? And that's where the issues start to come in. There's a lot of gray area. And generally, it's going to be, these three here. If someone is telling you what time you should work, where you should work, and they're providing the tools, you're probably an employee. If you're deciding your own schedule, I mean, if you jump around locations, you're probably an independent contractor, but it's not a set in stone thing. Important distinction, because if an independent contractor would file a Schedule C, and they'd have self-employment taxes as opposed to a W-2 where the employer would be paying their half of that. So deductibility of travel expenses. You got to be self-employed. W-2 employees no longer have these deductions for them. It's a deductible for AGI. It gets reported on the Schedule C. And here's my income, here's my expenses for AGI. Here's my net income that gets reported to employee. Employee deductible for AGI, it reimbursed and included in income. We kind of went over that earlier. It's the $10. If I'm recognizing the $10 in income, I'm also going to recognize the $10 deduction that I use to pay for the supplies. Not deductible if it's unreimbursed starting in 2018. That's the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Personal expenses, not deductible. If more personal time than work, it's considered personal. You could argue that it could be business. You'll probably lose that argument, but there have been cases where it should be primarily business is how the IRS words it. Requirements for the travel deduction. It's got to be business related, can't be personal. There's no personal deductions. Worker must be away from tax home. That's an important term. For sufficient duration to require sleep before returning home, but what is away from home? Again, these are kind of gray areas. And the IRS tries to define it, but there's still some gray. Where is the taxpayer's home? Is it your personal residence? Is it where you're working? What is it? So we've got principal place of employment. That's your tax home. It's not your residence, but it is your tax home for income tax purposes. For long-term postings, this can change and disagree with your family residence. Generally, it's the year-long test, and then it becomes indefinite. And now, so if I'm here, but I'm supposed to go work over here for a duration of a year or greater, this now becomes my indefinite home. If it's less than a year, it's temporary, and I would have some deductions I'd be able to use there. But for income tax purposes greater than a year, this is my income, and travel expenses would not. You have temporary versus indefinite versus permanent. Temporary, 3 or 4 days per week, or 3 or fewer days per week. Definite, more than a year, 5 days per week, based on your expected duration. If I'm expected to be here for 8 months, but it ends up being 15, the 8 months would be deductible. The other 7 months to get to the 15 would not be. It now becomes indefinite. Temporary, like I was talking about, those travel expenses are deductible. Definite, your tax home has now shipped to that new location. Your travel expenses would not be deductible. Other travel expense limitations, foreign travel, it's going to be personal, unless there's an absolute fantastic reason why you have to have it overseas and not stateside. General education trips, generally not a deduction. You got to have a specific event or destination. I believe the book uses an example of a French teacher going to France to better understand the language. That would not be deductible. Transport on luxury water vessels limited to twice the highest federal per diem. For 23, that's 365. So you get twice that. And that would be your 365 times 2, 730. That would be what you would be limited to. Conventions or meetings on cruise ships got to be directly related to the line of business, and it's limited to $2,000. I don't see this a lot. Generally, people who are traveling on luxury water vessels probably aren't, very often doing it for a business purpose. They might try to argue it, but it's, there are certain situations where it would be, but a lot of the time, it's a convention on a cruise ship. It feels more personal. Transportation expenses. This is a big one that I have to talk to clients about quite a bit. Taxpayer can deduct transportation costs of 10 miles even if he goes home between jobs. So he's got job 1 and job 2. This is a deduction. This 5 miles from his home to job one is not. This 8 miles from home to job two isn't. Um, Taxpayer can take the travel between the two sites, but not the local commute from home and a site. Any additional trips home are limited to the distance the employee would have driven from one site to the next. So in this situation, if he travels to job one, 5 miles, not deductible. And then he goes home and then goes this 8 miles. So that'd be 18 miles that he would have driven. He's only allowed a deduction for the 10, right? Even though he went 18, it's only from job to job. It's not from home to job. And that's a conversation I have to have with clients quite a bit. Hey, you know what? If you're going to be traveling for work, um, make sure you go from a job to a job before going home. Don't go from a job to home. Go from a job to home. Then you at least get a partial deduction. Automobile expenses. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna stop it right there because this gets to be pretty in the weeds. There's a lot of calculations and items associated with actual versus standard mileage. So we will get into that after this.